On a weekday afternoon in small towns across America, the scene still looks familiar at first glance. A parking lot that's half full, a row of storefronts that have been there longer than most people can remember. The kind of place where errands used to blur into conversations, where a quick stop almost always turned into running into someone you knew. Nothing looks broken, nothing looks dramatic, but something feels different. The doors still open and close, the lights still turn on. Yet the rhythm is slower now, the pauses are longer, and the space feels quieter in a way that's hard to explain unless you've noticed it yourself. For decades, certain stores quietly anchored daily life in neighborhoods and cities that rarely made headlines. They weren't landmarks, they weren't attractions, they were simply there, dependable, routine, woven into the background of everyday American life. You stopped by without thinking, you planned your day around them without realizing it. And when they were gone, there was no single moment when everything changed. No sirens, no breaking news. Just a subtle shift that settled in over time. People didn't panic. They adjusted. They drove a little farther. They planned a little more carefully. They waited a little longer. Each change on its own felt manageable, almost insignificant. But taken together, those small adjustments began to carry weight. Life didn't fall apart. It just felt heavier. The margin for error got thinner. The room for spontaneity quietly disappeared. What makes this harder to define is that nothing about it feels like a crisis. There's no clear beginning, no dramatic ending. Just the sense that something ordinary, something stable, slowly slipped away without ever asking for attention. And because it happened gradually, many people didn't notice it until much later, when the absence became part of the routine itself. So, when the stores that once held these communities together quietly closed their doors, what exactly changed? And why did it take so long for anyone to name it? At first, it's easy to treat this as an isolated feeling, something tied to a single street, a single errand, a single memory. One town loses a store. One family adjusts their routine. One person notices that something feels off but can't quite explain why. Yet, when you start looking beyond a single experience, a broader pattern begins to emerge. Similar stories surface in small towns, familiar neighborhoods, and quiet cities spread across the country. Different places, different people, the same subtle shift. What makes this pattern difficult to recognize is that it never announces itself. These changes don't show up in headlines. They don't arrive all at once. They unfold slowly over recent years, blending into everyday life until they feel normal. A store closes here. Hours are reduced there. A service quietly disappears. Each moment seems minor, even reasonable on its own. There's no clear event to point to, no single decision that explains everything. Just a steady accumulation of small losses that rarely attract attention. This isn't about individual failure. It isn't about bad choices or poor planning. And it isn't limited to one region or one type of community. Variations of the same story can be found nationwide, from rural highways to former manufacturing hubs to towns built around a single main street. People adapt because they have to. They fill the gaps where they can. They accept inconvenience as part of modern life. Over time, the adjustments stop feeling temporary and start feeling permanent. What's striking is how consistent the emotional response is. Not anger, not outrage. Just a quiet sense that everyday life now requires more effort than it used to. More coordination, more time, more mental space. And because these changes don't arrive as a crisis, they're rarely discussed as one. They're experienced privately, absorbed individually, and rarely connected to a larger trend. The result is a shared experience that many people recognize, but few talk about openly. A slow tightening that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, yet feels unmistakable on the inside. And once you see it as a pattern rather than a coincidence, it raises a much larger question about what happens when familiar systems fade quietly, all at once, across the United States. For decades, certain types of stores played a role in small towns that went far beyond what they sold. They weren't just places to buy groceries, tools, or household basics. They functioned as informal meeting points, Predictable, neutral spaces where daily life overlapped without effort. You didn't need an appointment. You didn't need a reason. You went because that's where people went. Over time, these stores became part of how communities organized themselves, quietly shaping routines in ways few people ever stopped to name. In many neighborhoods, these stores helped define the rhythm of the week. Errands weren't isolated tasks, they were social signals. A short stop could turn into a conversation. A familiar face behind the counter could turn a transaction into recognition. For older residents, these places reinforced continuity, proof that something from earlier years still held. For families, they offered stability, predictable hours, familiar layouts, a sense that daily life had a reliable center. For workers, they provided not just employment, but a visible role within the community itself. What made these stores powerful wasn't size or efficiency. It was repetition, the comfort of knowing exactly where to go, what to expect, and who you might see. Over the years, these patterns became invisible precisely because they worked so well. No one called them essential. No one framed them as infrastructure. They simply existed, quietly supporting the social fabric of cities that relied more on familiarity than novelty. Looking back, it's clear how much emotional weight these places carried without ever asking for attention. They anchored time as much as space. They marked ordinary moments, after school, before dinner, between shifts. And because they were so deeply woven into routine, their importance was rarely recognized while they were still there. They didn't feel special. They felt normal. That normality, built slowly, reinforced daily, and taken for granted for decades, is what made their absence so disorienting later. Not because something dramatic disappeared overnight, but because something quietly essential had been doing its work in the background all along. The changes didn't arrive all at once. They showed up gradually, in ways that were easy to dismiss at first. A sign on the door listing new hours, fewer cars in the parking lot, shelves that looked a little more spaced out than before. In small towns, these shifts didn't feel like warnings. They felt like temporary adjustments. Something practical, something reasonable. People assumed things would return to normal soon. But over time, the differences became harder to ignore. Operating hours grew shorter. Entire sections of the store closed off. Familiar staff members were suddenly gone, replaced by rotating faces or no one at all. The space itself began to feel different. More open, more hollow, more quiet. What once felt predictable now required checking ahead. A quick stop turned into a calculated decision. Convenience slowly gave way to planning. In many neighborhoods, the surrounding area changed along with the store. Nearby businesses adjusted their schedules or closed entirely. Foot traffic dropped. Streets that once felt active during certain parts of the day became noticeably still. These weren't dramatic scenes of collapse. There were no boarded windows at first, no obvious signs of failure, just fewer lights on after dark, fewer reasons to linger. What made this stage especially difficult to process was how normal it all appeared on the surface. Stores didn't vanish overnight. They shrank, they simplified, they reduced. Each step felt logical in isolation. Fewer customers meant fewer staff. Fewer staff meant reduced hours. Reduced hours meant fewer reasons to stop by. The cycle fed itself quietly, without demanding attention. For people living nearby, the experience was subtle but persistent. Trips took longer. Errands required driving extra miles. Timing became less flexible. None of it felt catastrophic. But taken together, these visible changes altered how daily life moved through cities and towns that once relied on easy access and familiar routines. What remained wasn't emptiness. It was something more restrained, more cautious, a version of everyday life that asked for more effort than it used to. Behind the visible changes, quieter forces were at work. Nothing abstract, nothing technical, just a steady rise in basic costs that made operating these stores harder each year. Rent increased, labor became more expensive and harder to retain, insurance premiums climbed, logistics grew more complex, more delayed, more expensive. None of these pressures appeared suddenly, and none of them came with a single explanation. They accumulated, slowly tightening the space these businesses had to operate in. For stores that once relied on thin margins and steady foot traffic, even small increases carried weight. A modest jump in rent meant fewer employees. Fewer employees meant reduced hours. Reduced hours meant fewer customers. Each adjustment was practical, even necessary. But together they formed a pattern that was difficult to escape. The business didn't fail in one dramatic moment. It became less flexible, less forgiving, more fragile. What's important here is how ordinary these pressures were. There was no financial crisis sign posted on the door, no warning label for the community. From the outside, everything still looked functional. The lights were on, the shelves were stocked, just not as fully as before. But the room for error had narrowed. A single bad week could now matter. A missed delivery could ripple outward. There was no cushion left, no buffer to absorb disruption. For owners and workers alike, this created a constant state of adjustment. Decisions became defensive rather than hopeful. Plans focused on staying open rather than improving. Over time, the effort required to maintain the same level of service simply became unsustainable. Not because anyone made the wrong choice, but because the basic math no longer worked in their favor. This kind of pressure rarely sparks public conversation because it doesn't feel dramatic, it feels administrative, it feels inevitable. And by the time its effects become visible to the community, the underlying structure has already been stretched too thin to recover. When these stores finally closed, the impact wasn't felt all at once. It settled unevenly, touching different people in different ways. For older residents in small towns, the loss often meant more than inconvenience. Familiar routes were broken. Simple errands now required longer drives, careful timing, and reliance on others. What used to be a short walk or a predictable stop became a planned outing, adding quiet friction to everyday life. For families, the change reshaped routines. After-school stops disappeared. Weekend errands stretched across wider distances. Time that once allowed for flexibility became structured around availability and travel. Nothing about this felt dramatic, but it narrowed choices. It reduced spontaneity. Small decisions now carried extra weight, especially in rural areas where alternatives were limited. For workers, the closure meant more than lost jobs. It removed visible roles that connected people to their community. These stores weren't just workplaces. They were points of recognition. You were known there. You were part of the daily flow. When those roles vanished, so did a sense of participation that's difficult to replace. Employment might be found elsewhere, but not always nearby, and not always in ways that felt connected to local life. Across small towns and quiet cities, the broader effect was subtle but persistent. Fewer shared encounters, fewer casual conversations, fewer reasons for people to cross paths. Community didn't disappear, it thinned. It became more private, more segmented, more dependent on effort rather than routine. Life continued, but it required more coordination and more energy to maintain the same sense of connection. What stands out is how rarely this impact was discussed openly. There were no town halls for lost familiarity, no announcements for the erosion of daily contact. The consequences lived in altered habits, longer drives, quieter afternoons. Not a crisis, but a steady recalibration of what everyday life demanded from the people living there. By the time these changes became impossible to ignore, the moment for easy answers had already passed. The stores were gone. The routines had adjusted. Life had reorganized itself around absence rather than presence. What remained wasn't outrage or collapse, but a quieter uncertainty. A sense that something essential had been removed without anyone ever agreeing it mattered in the first place. In small towns and familiar neighborhoods, people adapted because they had no alternative. They learned new routes. They accepted longer drives. They planned ahead. Over time, these adjustments stopped feeling temporary and started feeling normal. And that normalization made the loss harder to name. When inconvenience becomes routine, it stops registering as a problem and starts registering as reality. The question that lingers isn't why these stores closed. That part feels almost too simple. Costs, pressure, and slow erosion explain the mechanics well enough. The deeper question is what happens to a community when shared spaces disappear quietly, not replaced by something new, but simply removed, when there's no longer a natural place for paths to cross, when everyday encounters require intention instead of coincidence. What changes when a town no longer has a common center for ordinary life? Not a festival, not a landmark, just a place people once passed through without thinking. And if those spaces were doing more work than anyone realized, socially, emotionally, structurally, what fills the gap when they're gone? There's no clear answer, and perhaps that's why this moment feels unresolved. The impact isn't loud enough to demand attention, yet it's too widespread to ignore. It lives in the background of daily decisions, shaping how people move, plan, and connect without ever announcing itself. If the stores that once quietly held these communities together are gone, what replaced the role they played? And what happens if nothing truly does? Over time, the effects of these closures moved beyond systems and into the texture of everyday life. The change wasn't dramatic. It showed up in smaller choices and quieter adjustments. People began organizing their days more carefully. Errands were grouped together. Trips were delayed until they felt worthwhile. What once happened casually now required intention. In small towns, this shift altered how time itself was experienced. Less fluid, more calculated. Daily habits narrowed. Spontaneous stops disappeared. Familiar shortcuts were replaced by longer routes. A task that once took minutes now required planning, fuel, and coordination. For many, the difference wasn't just distance or convenience. It was mental space. Each decision carried more weight because there were fewer options to fall back on. Life didn't feel unstable. It felt tighter. This tightening didn't signal collapse. Communities didn't unravel. People adapted, as they always do. But adaptation came with trade-offs. Social encounters became scheduled instead of incidental. Casual overlap gave way to purposeful contact. The everyday friction increased just enough to be felt, not enough to be named. In neighborhoods and quieter cities, the rhythm of daily life slowed, not because people had more time, but because movement required more effort. What's notable is how gradually this happened. Over time, each adjustment felt reasonable. Each change made sense on its own. But together, they reshaped how people related to their surroundings. Life became more efficient in some ways, but less forgiving in others. The margin for error shrank. Missed timing mattered more. Flexibility became a resource rather than a given. None of this looked like failure from the outside. Stores closed. Alternatives appeared farther away. People adjusted. The system continued to function. Yet the lived experience changed in a way that's difficult to measure but easy to recognize. Not loss, but constraint. Not crisis, but compression. A daily life that still worked, just with less room to breathe. What made this moment different wasn't any single loss. It was how many pressures began arriving at the same time. Housing costs rose. Utilities became less predictable. Groceries took a larger share of each trip. Transportation demanded more fuel, more maintenance, more planning. Wages adjusted slowly, often too slowly to keep pace. Each of these pressures existed before. What changed was how they converged, quietly stacking on top of one another. In small towns and surrounding rural areas, this convergence removed the margin people once relied on without realizing it existed. When one cost increased, another could be adjusted. When one plan failed, there was room to absorb it. That buffer slowly disappeared. Life didn't become impossible. It became less forgiving. A delayed paycheck mattered more. A higher bill lingered longer. A missed errand required rearranging the rest of the week. This is where the absence of local stores became more than inconvenience. When everyday systems were already under pressure, the loss of nearby access amplified everything else. Longer drives meant higher transportation costs. Fewer options meant less flexibility. Small inefficiencies multiplied. What once felt manageable began to feel fragile, not because people were failing, but because the system allowed less room for recovery. What's striking is how normal this felt while it was happening. There was no moment when everything broke, no clear signal that the balance had shifted. People adapted incrementally, absorbing each change as it came. Only later did the pattern become visible, multiple stresses converging in a way that left little space to breathe. The result wasn't collapse, it was compression, a daily life shaped by calculation rather than ease, by caution rather than spontaneity. When everything hits at once, even small losses carry more weight, not because they're large on their own, but because there's nothing left to cushion their impact. As these pressures settled into daily life, they carried a quiet emotional weight that was easy to overlook and hard to explain. Not fear, not panic, just a persistent sense of mental load. The feeling that ordinary decisions now required more attention than they once did. Planning replaced habit. Anticipation replaced ease. Over time, this constant adjustment created a subtle form of decision fatigue that shaped how people moved through their days. In small towns and familiar communities, life didn't feel unstable. It felt demanding. Each choice carried consequences. Each delay mattered. The sense of momentum people once relied on began to fade, replaced by careful calculation. It wasn't that progress stopped. It was that forward movement felt harder to maintain. The path ahead required more effort, more awareness, more restraint. What made this psychological shift difficult to address was how invisible it appeared from the outside. There were no obvious signs of distress. People showed up, they worked, they adapted. Yet beneath that adaptation was a quiet loss of lightness, the absence of small comforts that once reduced mental strain without anyone noticing. Convenience had served as relief, familiarity had served as support. When those disappeared, the weight transferred inward. This kind of mental strain rarely sparks conversation because it feels personal, even when it's widely shared. It doesn't register as a problem to solve, only as a state to endure. And because it builds gradually, it becomes part of the background, something people carry without naming, shaping their choices long after the original changes have faded from view. Looking back, it's clear that nothing ended in a single moment. Small towns didn't collapse when these stores closed. Life continued. People adjusted. Systems adapted. Yet, something quieter shifted beneath the surface. Not a crisis, but a rebalancing that asked more from everyday life than it once did. The absence didn't announce itself. It settled in slowly, becoming part of the routine. What remains is a question that feels both personal and shared. Not about the past, but about what fills the space left behind. When familiar places disappear, do new ones naturally take their place, or does daily life simply grow more fragmented over time? And if the role these stores played was never fully recognized while they existed, how do communities notice what's missing before it quietly fades again?